come once again to discuss things.
You want to go ahead and get started then?
Sure thing.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentlemen. I am Zid Partu, aka Ian Harrington. Joining me today is Steve Baxey, aka Steve Baxey.
Hello, aka me.
Yay. So here's a really broad topic that could mean a million things that we talk about in Geeky Gentlemen, so you can tell it's a really Geeky Gentleman-esque topic. We're going to be discussing tragedy and drama in fiction.
Yeah.
Where do you start with that? I don't know.
I think you start where it all starts, Aristotle.
Probably.
Yes.
Well, actually, I do have a better idea of where to start.
Oh.
So, like, I want to start with the reason I wanted to talk about this.
Oh, yeah, that's fair.
And that being, I've been having conversations with a lot of people about, like, movies or books that I'm reading or whatever. Like, I don't remember. I was talking to someone at work a couple weeks back about Tom King's Vision, and I'm like, it's the greatest thing ever. It's also super fucked and super, super sad.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, like, how so? And I talk about the scene with Vin reading Shakespeare projected through Vision's eye, and just how fucking unbelievably sad that is. And I sit there and I explain the whole situation, and the guy looks at me after and he goes, I couldn't read something like that. If I'm going to read something or watch something, I need it to be something I'm going to enjoy and have a good time with. I couldn't get behind the idea of watching or reading something that sad that's meant to be sad. And I'm like, why though? So, like, what is it about tragedy and drama that scares people away from it? When it's, you know, the other half of literature from comedy. Literally, there's the two faces, the smiley and the frowny. The frowny is the tragedy face. It's literally half of the literary art. Why does tragedy turn people off? And I've, like, heard this from multiple people. I was talking about Troy, the 2004 movie, and how I really liked a bunch of stuff in that to someone else at work. I have a lot of conversations at work. I was talking about how I really like a lot of the details they put in that. I'm like, yeah, it's really great when they, like, invade Troy finally, and you see the Greek soldiers, like, ripping the women out of their houses to, obviously the implication is rape them, and, like, taking babies and throwing them against the wall. And, like, they look at me and go, that's horrible. Why would you think that's great? I'm like, because it shows how fucked war is. It's tragic. Like, why isn't that great to show? But that somehow I'm the weird one here, Steve.
No, I'm with you. I know a lot of people where they get really into movies, not necessarily the way we do, where the atmosphere of a movie can, like, entice them and you still hear music reverberating in your bones and shit like that. But just, like, they have no concept of suspension of disbelief. Everything is always suspended. And so they just, like, yell at the screen. There's a Russian literary theorist that talks about this notion that books have a kind of dialogue where a character will say a series of sentences, and each sentence, if you break it down, reads like a conversation. So someone will say something like, I'm not feeling well, I have a headache, I should go see a doctor. And they say all three of those things, and we understand what those mean. But when you actually break it down, it operates that way because they'll say, I'm feeling sick. How do you know you're feeling sick? Because I have a headache. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to go see a doctor. Like, everything demands a response, and that's kind of just how we take in literature in general, is that we kind of accept those questions in our head. But I know a lot of people that don't have that, so they'll literally ask questions at the screen and get an answer from the screen seconds later. And it's kind of funny and amusing, but I think it goes to the whole notion of tragedy, that when you're that enticed that you're having a conversation with a thing that can't have a conversation with you, something like the tragedy is going to be much harder to deal with. Because the essence of all good tragedy, I'm convinced of, is a structure that explains to you exactly from point A to point B how you got where you are, but leaves you in an ending where you have no idea where you're going. And that's terrifying if you think of any sort of entertainment on those terms of having a conversation with you. Because it's like someone just walking away as you're asking questions.
Yeah, they kind of like, that's the ultimate fear, to be left without an answer.
Yep.
And ultimately, that's why I think tragedy is so important. Because guess what? Life has no answers. Right?
Yeah.
That is like such fortune cookie philosophy, but still, it sucks because it's true. Like there is no magic 8-ball you jiggle and it gives you the actual answers to life. I don't care what religion you have, what philosophy you go by. End of the day, you're kind of just left on your own to figure it out. And the fact that you were raised thinking that other people have it all figured out, no, it's all bullshit, man.
Yep.
No one's got it figured out. They're all just making it up as they go. And I think a tragedy highlights that, because yeah, you're right, it does leave you with questions. And so you're just, I don't know, like I still don't quite understand that. Like, I can't enjoy something that's sad. And I think, do you think part of it's that we've been raised in a society going back, roughly 100 years now with film, wherein we don't do sad endings? I feel like there are more readily available sad endings for stage than I can think of for film.
That's fair. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that we've stopped making sad endings. Pretty much every Oscar bait movie I've seen in the 2000s is on some level a deep tragedy, if not a deep drama. But you're right, as far as like the majority of stuff we see, there's very little of it. Yeah, I don't know.
It's that whole Hollywood formula, and we talked about this with Fruitvale Station last week, wherein like everything about that ending at the hospital sets you up for the classic Hollywood ending. He's gonna pull through, and then you get the stark reality. Yeah. He didn't make it, and it's just so much of the modern Hollywood machine is so focused on the happy ending, and maybe I'm being too short-sighted to our own media in our own time. I know at different points throughout history they like changed the endings to Shakespeare plays to give them a happy ending. I think they did that with Lear, of all things.
Yeah.
Though Lear is completely incomprehensible, so you can change the ending of that, it doesn't affect a goddamn thing. But still, there's just like there seems to be so much more of the happy ending in Hollywood. Just like, you know how many movies I think are great until they give them a good ending? You know how annoyed I am at seasons 3 and 4 of Black Mirror?
I mean, that's fair. Yeah.
Like, I don't know. That's just something that's been on my head. And I don't know how much of it is we're trained to not accept tragedy anymore, and how much of it's just, yeah, no, we've always had people who just can't handle it, but we remember the tragic plays and stuff. We remember the tragic stories because the people who knew what the fuck they were talking about understood why these have value.
Yeah. I guess maybe it's even worth saying, though, that I don't think we've ever really made mainstream the concept of non-happy endings, except for those movies that are Oscar bait. Because if you think about it, the noir genre got started because they were fed up with Hollywood happy endings, and that's still a really small and niche thing no matter who you talk to. The whole concept of tragic endings versus the Hollywood ending I wonder if that just goes as far back as film itself as opposed to literature, because I can think of very few books, except for young adult novels, that have happy endings.
Yeah.
Like, what's the last novel you read that has a happy ending, except for young adult stuff? I don't think any.
I'd say romance now. The Harlequins, those tend to have happy endings.
But those start as horror stories, so I don't know if how much counts.
I don't even understand where you get some of this stuff from, Steve, but I love it. Like, I have no doubt in my mind that you have a really good, reasoned out argument as to why that's the case. I don't want to hear it. I'm just gonna keep going.
No, that's fair. Yeah, I mean, romance is one genre potentially. But yeah, just in general, I'm having a hard time thinking of all the novels I've read that have happy endings. None of the Neil Gaiman novels I've read, except for the ones geared towards teenagers, tend to have happy endings.
Yeah, that's a good point. To be fair, I don't read a ton of traditional novels, and I also don't. When I do, they tend to be more horror-based stuff.
Fair.
So that's kind of a loaded question for me, but for other people, I think that maybe is something else to think about.
Because it seems like film engages, and not seems like it's certain that film engages people in a different way than any other form of art. That doesn't mean it's better; it just means it's different by virtue of being different. But I think because of that difference, it's really hard to sell someone on something being inherently tragic or requiring a tragedy. And that's a shame, because I think almost all of my favorite films are tragedies.
That probably says something about you as a person.
Yeah, I was actually having a conversation. This is a side tangent. I was actually having a conversation with a friend the other day. We just got back from dinner, and she asked me who my favorite TV mom was. And without a second's hesitation, I said Buffy's mom. And then she asked who my favorite TV dad was. And I realized almost all of my favorite male characters are either not dads or shitty dads. And I can't think of a single good TV father. And maybe that means I have issues.
Maybe. Huh. Good television dads.
Right?
That's a good question. Yeah. Fuck.
The best I got's Danny Tanner, and that is still not great because he's weirdly too suburban white guy.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe Hal from Malcolm in the Middle?
Maybe.
Like, there's an episode where Francis comes back home after, just fucking leaving military school. He comes back home, and Hal just runs out of the house screaming and chases him down the street. And then, you see them start to get in a fight, and then you see them, limping back home, supporting each other, covered in bruises and shit. And he's like, sorry, I used the ankle twister on you. He goes, no, I taught it to you for a reason. I'm like, that's a really, really particular father-son relationship.
That's fair. I've always thought of Hal as being a little bit more oblivious than anything else, but certainly not a bad father character.
Yeah, okay, anyway.
Anyway.
No, but just, there's so much to talk about it. It's hard to wrestle this gator. So why don't we go where you were suggesting and talk about Aristotle then?
Yeah, so a while ago, a couple of years ago at this point, I did a video on my channel on Civil War and why Civil War was structurally a tragedy. And I based it heavily on Aristotle, but there's inklings of Shakespeare and Hegel throughout of it. And that video came about partly as a response to this really bizarre trend on the internet that wanted to defend Batman vs. Superman as a brilliant film. So someone on Tumblr wrote this really long and elaborate essay on why that movie is an Elizabethan tragedy. And it's literally not. No one that understands literary theories of tragedy should commit to that interpretation of Batman vs. Superman, even if they like it and it's ridiculous. But that's partly why I wrote the one on Civil War, because I thought Civil War actually was a tragedy. So Aristotle's got two texts. He's got the comedy and he's got the poetics. And the comedy was lost to time centuries ago. I don't know. There are bits here and there that people say come from the comedy, but we never actually know because it's a lost text. The Poetics is a response to Plato's theory of art in the Republic, and it's the first kind of detailed account of what tragedy is. And part of it's a formula of how you make a tragedy, and part of it's interpretations and just empirical data based on what he saw at that period in time, because the Greeks only had comedies and tragedies. On one end of the spectrum, you have shit like Oedipus Rex. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a play about people who wanted to see who can fart the highest. So the Greeks are really weird. And Aristotle's theory of tragedy is really interesting to me because there's a lot of cool political implications that people pick out later, specifically Jacques Rancière. But that notwithstanding, Aristotle's concept of tragedy was really simple because it basically said that what's true of tragedy is true of every good story, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I think it's interesting nonetheless because that was the dominant genre trend for centuries until we got to film and TV. And the core premise he had is there's an upward slope on the story scale that's all about setting up causes, and everything after that is detailing the effects. And so you have a point in the middle that after all the mounting causes kind of breaks the character, and then everything after that is like this slow wrestling of every cause now has its subsequent effect, and then the play ends, and you're left with uncertainty because the entire story built up this notion of this is happening for a reason, this is happening for a reason, this is happening for a reason, and it's all built on the ancient Greek idea of destiny and the sisters of fate and all that. But I always really liked that. I really liked that notion that tragedy is really tragic because you know why you're there, in a way that other stories don't necessarily have. Like cliche romances, it's all chance encounters. Fate's there, but it's just kind of a catchword. It doesn't operate that way. Everything's just kind of lucky happenstances, and that's what makes people happy is lucky happenstances. But tragedy is tragic because you understand, and I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, there's, like, you mentioned Oedipus Rex, and I think that is kind of the go-to example for the classic Greek tragedy. Oedipus finds out that the true murderer of the former king still reigns free, so he vows to take the eyes out of whoever the true king's murderer is, and then he begins the investigation, and he eventually finds out it was him, and so he beheaded his mother and killed his father, and so he had to rip out his own eyes, and that lifted the curse from the kingdom. And the interesting thing about that tragedy is, of course, Oedipus was sent away from his kingdom because there was a prophecy saying he would kill his father to marry his mother. And he left his adoptive family because he heard the prophecy that he would marry his mother, kill his father. And he killed his father because he was trying to get away from that situation. And he married his mother because he was trying to get as far away from that situation as he possibly could. And so it just creates this really interesting dynamic wherein every choice he makes is part of his ultimate destiny. There's this constant theme in a lot of Greek stories of you can never cheat destiny. All you'll do is end up making it come true. And I think that is part of a really, really fascinating worldview that ties in directly with tragedy, being that you are destined to do whatever you will do. You make your own choices. You dig your own grave or build your own mausoleum. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. A somewhat happier alternative, but both ending in death. How's that? Like, you are the one that makes the choices that put you where you're going to be in the world. And, that's not completely untrue, though I do think it's overly simplistic.
It is definitely simplistic, but for the nature of storytelling, I think it's fine.
Yeah. So, like, it creates this worldview that's really, really interesting, but very polarizing, very, what's the word? Not dynamic. Dialectic, maybe? I don't know.
Maybe there is a dialectic
twofold
theory of tragedy that kind of goes with what you're saying.
The duality is the word I'm looking for. It creates this interesting duality wherein your success or your failures in life are dependent on you. And that was very emblematic of Greek thinking, but it's got this underlying sense to it. Like, anytime anything in your life goes wrong, who is the first person you blame? Yourself.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's such this thing of, like, this notion that everyone just blames their problems on someone else. No, like, everyone first blames something on themselves and then creates an excuse as to why it's someone else's fault, true or not. Yeah.
And I like that you brought the blame yourself aspect into the fate discussion, because, again, Oedipus is a good example. Partly because I think Oedipus is... I think this is probably true. As far as great trilogies go, you've got Lord of the Rings, and you got Oedipus.
Star Wars doesn't do it for you.
No, I mean, I like all of the Star Wars original trilogies to varying degrees, but I can certainly see how for a lot of people, Return of the Jedi isn't as good as the rest, and very few people make that argument when it comes to Lord of the Rings, because they think all three movies are equivalently great. Same can be said of Oedipus. All three plays are equally great.
Oedipus, Antigone...
Oedipus as Colonus is the third one. It was written third, but it's set between Rex and Antigone.
Okay.
But that was going to be my example, because Oedipus at Colonus is... Basically, Oedipus goes to a town called Colonus, which is like on the outskirts of Athens, and he has Antigone lead him there, and Antigone's brother, whose name I can't remember. And the whole play is centered on discussing why the events of Oedipus Rex were both fate and consequences of Oedipus feeling guilty. He says there that he brought this on himself to the degree that he felt guilty that the previous king died and he shouldn't have.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really interesting. Because Sophocles has a lot of plays. I don't think any of them are particularly great besides from these three. Because I think the Oedipus trilogy, as we'll call it, has a lot of really good self-awareness that leads to important theories of tragedy later with Aristotle. The kind of like need for necessary events comes in Oedipus Rex, the guilt comes in Oedipus at Colonus, and then the further uncertainty and shifting the burden of that to the people that survive it comes in with Antigone. Because Antigone is almost entirely ruled by the association to the other two plays.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's the ultimate sequel, right?
Yeah.
Huh. Sequels, nothing new. Yeah. Then there's a lot of other Greek tragedies that just get progressively more fucked. Like, I can't remember the name of it, but there's this play where someone doesn't want to celebrate Dionysus on his festival day or some shit.
Ooh, I think I've read this shit. What is it called?
Yeah, and Dionysus forces his spirit onto them, forcing them to celebrate him in his honor, but he goes kind of hardcore with it. Dionysus is a bit of a party boy, and makes them, like, cut off their children's head and bathe in their blood and, you know, carry it through the streets and all this stuff. And I'm like, fuck.
Greek gods are petty. I don't know if you've established this, but they're super petty.
Super fucking petty. No, so there's, like, a lot of really, really, like, fucked shit in Greek plays. And, you know, you mentioned earlier, like, can you think of novels with happy endings? I think, to be fair, the novel is a relatively new art form.
It is.
Not as new as film, but still.
It is. I mean, because we had plays and we had poetry for the longest time. And then when novels came about in the late 1800s and were more popularized in the early 1900s, a lot of people didn't think they were art. There was decades of literary theory that came about trying to understand what makes a novel art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, like, I think it was Hegel, he called the novel The Triumph of the Middle Class or something like that.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So just the idea of, like, tragedy and being more adept to film or more seeming to have more of a connection on film, I think it's because film is honestly just the logical extension of theater. Film is theater with technology in a certain sense. And not to belittle film or theater, they're distinct art forms now, but film doesn't exist without theater, period, end of story. So
many classic quote-unquote movies are either adaptations of theatrical plays or straight-up adaptations of novels, which is interesting because when you translate certain plays into movies, we almost never mess with the play structure, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a film. And certain things come up as awkward, like, for example, in The Odd Couple, where one of the characters goes off screen to get drinks, so the other three characters are in the main room with each other. And in a play, you don't question this because people move in and out of spaces all the time, no matter how long it takes for them to come back. But you question it in a movie, so when you watch it in the movie, it feels like he's gone for an eternity, and it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a lot of interesting little... Like, it's hard to talk about this entire branch of literature because, like, it necessitates talking about particular things within different contexts, right?
Yeah.
So then, I guess the other big thing to get at would be, like, what do you learn from a tragedy? What do you, the audience, learn from a tragedy?
So, for me at least, I think the ultimate goal of art is to generate some kind of affect, that it's supposed to trick you into caring, and trick sounds bad, but I don't think it's bad in this context. And I think the ultimate goal of tragedy and why people need to read more or watch more or understand more of them is because tragedy makes you suffer with another character, and it teaches you how to understand suffering. And that's extremely important because it's not just enough to, like, share empathy with people. I think it's really important to understand there's a difference between being empathetic and understanding suffering.
Yeah. I agree. And that's what worries me when people say things like, I only watch media to be entertained. I don't want it to make me feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think the ultimate problem comes from. That is, you can understand that horrible things happen in the world, but if you refuse to engage with even fictitious representations of that, then you are creating a bubble around yourself. You are creating a way to remove yourself from reality, and that's dangerous.
I agree. I agree. Reality, more often than not, is very tragic.
Mm-hmm.
And I can understand why the tragedy of reality makes you not want to experience that in your fiction, because your fiction is supposed to... for a lot of people, fiction is supposed to be some kind of emotional support, which
or
I understand.
Escapism.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even necessarily want to say escapism. I think escapism is good and bad in certain contexts. But even more than escapism, I think fiction has the ability to allow people to see the world in certain ways. That the reason representation in fiction matters is because for a lot of people, it's how they form their understanding and their ability to deal with the world, that they have some kind of idealized fictional universe that teaches them that the world could be different, and that's important. And I don't think that's relegated to escapism. But I can understand why that sort of desire for your fiction to almost be utopian or to show you that the world can be a better place makes it so wanting to watch things that are deeply tragic is hard. We were talking about this last week with Fruitvale Station, like you brought up before, but if you know people that have deep personal experiences with unarmed black people being shot in the street by police, don't watch that movie.
Mm-hmm.
And that, because that movie is a tragedy. It's a tragedy in every sense of the word. And people need to understand the suffering that movie is trying to convey. But there are some people that emotionally are not capable of it, and that's okay. If you are, however, you probably should watch it.
Yeah. And, that brings me into another interesting point, which is Fruitvale Station does what Arthur Miller wanted to do. Arthur Miller had the famous, he took the famous challenge because I believe it's Aristotle says that a tragedy has to happen to a great person. Yeah. Great man is, I think, the term Aristotle used, but let's be kind and update that. And Arthur Miller took the dissenting opinion and said, no, a tragedy can happen to anyone, and that was the whole point of Death of the Salesman. Problem is, Death of the Salesman is fucking boring. So it kind of was I guess Aristotle's right. But I think Fruitvale Station, there are other films, of course, that do this, where it's not a world leader or some kind of famous individual. It's just a normal dude, and their life gets turned upside down and kind of thing. Fruitvale Station does that, though. It shows just normal, everyday person and the tragedy that their death brings.
Yeah, because when Aristotle said tragedy has happened to a great man, it's because he wanted two things. One is the quote-unquote villain of the tragedy for Aristotle can't be, malicious and mustache swirling. The point of the villain was to be a consequence of the hero, and that the hero has great hubris, which is why he creates someone that doesn't like him, not someone that's just inherently evil. Mm-hmm. And that person who does not like the hero has to chip away at the utopian image of the hero to get rid of the hubris. And most Greek plays are super meta. And so Aristotle kind of needed that meta trope of a tragic hero, but then later with Elizabethan and Hegelian tragedies, you got rid of that notion of a tragic hero. And like you said with Arthur Miller, that's definitely true. But yeah, it seems like more often than not with most movies, most of the tragedies I could think of, if they don't happen to common people, the people that they happen to are treated like commoners, like in Bruges.
Oh, man. Bruges is a weird flick.
I love that movie. I think that is legit my favorite movie.
It's funny. I was just watching The Matador the other night. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
I have. It's been a while, though.
Yeah, it's funny. We were talking about James Bond last week, and I was like, oh, yeah, Pierce Brosnan can't really act. And then for whatever reason, I wanted to watch The Matador, and I completely forgot it was Pierce Brosnan in that, and turns out I was wrong. Pierce Brosnan can definitely act. Just takes the right script. But in Bruges, The Matador, Big Nothing, I kind of put a lot of these movies together. There's a very similar thing going on with all of them.
Is Pierce Brosnan in Bruges?
No, he's in The Matador.
Oh, because you said In Bruges when you listed all Pierce Brosnan movies.
No, I was talking about In Bruges, The Matador, Big Nothing.
Okay, yeah.
These are all movies that share a common kind of tone to them or something.
Yeah.
This common, I don't know, who gives a fuck about murder?
Yeah, well, and the other really big one that doesn't start as a movie but starts as a play that has the same principle from Arthur Miller, but is better than Arthur Miller, is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Because that play was the first time I read anything that fucked me up in the head.
Oh yeah? I don't think I've ever seen or read Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf.
So when I was in high school, I read a lot even before I was in high school, but it tended to be more generic stuff. I read Dracula and I read Sherlock Holmes and stuff like that. It was nothing major. It was just fun escapist stuff at that point. When I was in high school, I was in this thing called the IB program, which look it up if you're interested. But the way our English class was run when we did that is if we had a play that we had to read, we would pick a scene or pick an act for that day that we could run through in an hour and a half, and everyone would get assigned characters, and we would actually stand up and read the play out loud, which I thought was super helpful. And it helped in particular with Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, because Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is really funny, in a way that doing that with Shakespeare can just be kind of boring if you're not into Shakespeare. So I remember having this super great time, because Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is about a couple that invites another couple over for a dinner party. And the evening basically spirals downward into tragedy. So everyone, these fucking high school kids, mind you, are sitting here reading these middle-aged people getting excessively drunk over the course of a night and having nonsensical arguments that are hilarious. So the mood of that is really infectious. And then you get to like the third act, and after all the buildup of the couple whose house you're in talking about their deadbeat son, you get the revelation of he's not a deadbeat son. He literally just died and they are drunk out of their minds. Wow. And it fucks everyone up. Because you're talking about 2 acts, 2 class periods where everyone in class is just laughing and having fun, watching these middle-aged people get progressively drunk and not understand the difference between math and history. And then suddenly you have to convey this character that lost their son and spent the whole night bad-mouthing him because they're mad that he died.
Man.
Like, that book fucked me up.
I bet. Shit, I'm a little mad you told me what it's about now.
I kind of assumed everyone sort of knows the twist ending, but apparently not.
No, I like, it's one of those things I'd like heard of, but I never, got around to for whatever reason.
So I stayed away from every adaptation of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf for years after reading that play because I just thought it was a brilliant play. But watch the 60s movie with Elizabeth Taylor. It's really good.
Okay.
It's basically just the play on screen, and you'll notice some of those quirks of, like, if this was on a stage, you wouldn't question the direction. But it's on film, so it's really awkward, but it's fine.
Yeah. Okay, so some of the stuff with tragedy that, again, we were talking about the need to be able to empathize and how tragedy makes you better at that. Comedy does a great job of creating empathy too, but what would you say makes the difference between the two of them?
I think what makes the difference...
Like, hold on, let me actually put a finer point on that, because What is the difference between comedy and tragedy? What is the difference between the empathy created by comedy and tragedy?
So I think the big difference is the empathy that comedy generates always kind of holds your hand, where a lot of comedies, specifically contemporary comedies, are about people that get shit on, and it's kind of funny that they're getting shit on. But you're with them enough, or laughing with them enough tonally, that even when the bad things happen and you don't know where you're going by the end of it, there is a sense of optimism where the movie or the book or whatever you're reading is holding your hand through the narrative. Tragedy doesn't have that. I think tragedy has a really, really thorough way to pull you in, and then it severely lets you go. And I think an example of this is the comedy would be Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and the tragedy would be Captain America: Civil War. Because when you watch something like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, have you watched that show?
A little bit.
Okay, yeah, I love that show. I think it's hilarious. But when you watch Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and you're seeing progressively shittier and shittier things happening to characters, by the end of it, there's always the character kind of does what you want them to do. Like if the plot gets going because the character is a jerk, by the end of the story, they've either learned their lesson or are content with not learning their lesson. So you have a sense of closure, and it keeps you engaged on that level. Versus something like Captain America: Civil War, that pulls you in really dramatically from the beginning of why you care about these characters and why there's a tragedy and why Tony feels the need to do the things he does versus why Steve feels the need to do the things he does. But then by the end, when Steve and Tony are fighting, you are completely pushed away. There is nothing you can do, say, or hope for that is resolving this fight, and you just have to watch it.
Mm-hmm. Because, I remember the marketing for Civil War was choose your side and all this stuff.
Which was bullshit.
Yeah, because there's no side to be on.
Yeah.
they're both right.
Yeah. No, that was my favorite thing about that movie, is that it made a story about choosing sides literally not that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, Black Panther will sit on a mountain and listen to your problems if you're a bad guy. I heard someone say the other day that T'Challa's character is completely different between Civil War and Black Panther. I completely disagree.
Yeah, I don't see it. I had someone point that out to me, saying that T'Challa learns to not seek vengeance at the end of Civil War, but he acts like he needs vengeance in the opening of Black Panther. I don't think that's what's happening.
What? Yeah, no, not at all. Like, he's trying to get justice. That's why he doesn't just murder the shit out of Claw right away, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't get it. Okay, anyway. No, that's a really good point. The tragedy is watching something happen and knowing that it kind of needs to happen. Whereas, like, the empathy in comedy is watching something happen and knowing it doesn't need to at all.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
the lessons are typically very clear in comedy.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a good example with that for comedy. Because, I don't know, there's like the classic of the piano hanging, right?
Yeah.
Because, like, in tragedy... All right, let's use Fruitvale Station, since it's fresh in our minds. The tragedy of Fruitvale Station is... It doesn't need to happen. He doesn't need to get shot. He doesn't need to go out at night. And there's these moments of, like, intense, dramatic irony wherein he is, trying to decide not to take the train, or trying to convince his girlfriend not to go out that night, and they ultimately make the decision to do it. But, like, even though what you're going to see happen doesn't need to happen, there's, like, this sense of it has to anyway. Whereas with comedy, like, the typical idea of literally seeing someone walk back and forth, like, someone walks out of their apartment building while their neighbors are moving in, and they're moving a piano into the balcony kind of thing. That classic, iconic scenario, right? Everyone's had that happen to them. And so, like, the character walks out of their apartment building, and they walk right under the piano, and the line moves a little bit. And they don't notice it. They're completely oblivious to the world. And they get, like, a couple feet away, and then they go, oh, I forgot something. Turn around to go walk back up the stairs, and then they pat their pocket and realize, nope, I have my keys, I'm good. Turn back around, start walk right under the piano again. It goes back and forth. They keep forgetting something, keep walking back and forth, and then eventually, when they're finally getting on their way, that's when the piano falls on them. And, like, that's funny, because what happened to that person did not need to at all if they could just be decisive for 2 goddamn seconds.
Fair.
But it's funny because it's this comeuppance thing, but you empathize with them because you've been in that situation where you've turned around 7 times to go back into your goddamn house because you keep forgetting something. The empathy for comedy comes in, you've been in this situation, now here's the world turned up to 10 on the ridiculous scale, and the consequences that could come for you being in this very human situation. Whereas for me, the empathy in tragedy comes through, you could be in this situation, and no one could do anything to stop it. Mm-hmm. And so you just need to sit there and experience what it would be like if you were there. And it creates an empathy in understanding what other people are going through, because you haven't been in that situation, but you could.
Do you have a favorite tragic work? From comics, because I feel like we haven't talked about comics much, and I think there's a lot to say there, but holding that off for now, for comics, books, plays, movies, TV, do you have a favorite tragedy? Because I think mine's probably Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf at this point.
I'm doing the old look over at my movie collection here, and I own a lot of genre stuff. Nothing jumps to mind right away.
Does Killing Joke, is that something that makes your list?
I don't know, maybe. I think it's definitely a tragic story.
I was going to say, because I think there might be some contention, depending on who you talk to, whether or not Killing Joke counts as a tragedy, but I think it does.
I'd agree. Yeah, I think Killing Joke's something I love, and so it's hard not to call that a tragedy. We were talking about it a little bit earlier off recording, but Dark Knight, I think, is a very tragic film.
I agree. I think, Dark Knight's definitely a tragedy. I wish superhero movies did more tragedies. Because we have kind of like the Shakespearean epic sense with a lot of them, but more Civil War style, just straight up build you up and break you down movies would be nice.
Mm-hmm.
Because Civil War is kind of the only one that I can think of that's like straight up tragedy. Dark Knight is tragic, but I wouldn't call it a tragedy. Black Panther is more Shakespearean than anything.
Mm-hmm. And that's got a pretty triumphant ending in a lot of ways.
It really does. There's tragic elements to Killmonger, but it's not a tragedy even from his perspective.
Because he gets kind of what he wants. He gets a portion of what he wanted.
Depending on when you turn Punisher off, it probably is.
Yeah. Neil Gaiman has this quote in one of my favorite issues. Oh, Sandman. Sandman's a tragedy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
But he has this great quote in one of the issues, 24-Hour Diner, which is probably the most horrific comic book I've ever read.
That one will always fuck me up, yeah.
Yeah. There's this quote in there where he's it's about the waitress who's also a writer, and she writes awful stories in her yellow legal pads, and there's just this it's so Gaiman. She knows the secret to a happy story is where you end it, because if you keep letting the story go, they all have sad endings.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there is something to that. I love the Three Stooges. Three Stooges is some classic comedy gold, in my opinion, and I'm just dreading the day I find out something awful about the Three Stooges that ruins them, because it'll happen. It's 2018. But, you watch the Three Stooges, and you get laughs out of all of it, and then you find out about the shit those guys actually went through. There's a biopic about the Three Stooges, and Mo was fucking someone's, grown-ass man gopher at a studio.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fucked. That dude worked his ass off for, 30 years, making some of the most well-beloved and timeless comedy films. And he got completely screwed out of the rights to him and ended up being a fucking coffee boy for a studio executive. What kind of bullshit?
Yeah.
So there is this idea that tragedy is inevitable and a happy ending just depends on where you end it. What's the sunniest happy ending you can think of for literally any story?
Sunniest happy ending I can ever think of.
Yeah, just name any story. Preferably something I'll actually know of.
Yeah, damn. Why am I trying to think some happy endings?
Is All-Star Superman a tragedy?
Yeah. Kind of. I think it's a mix between the two. I was going to say Batman Brave and the Bold, the last episode.
Okay.
That is my favorite last episode of anything ever. It's just adorable.
Mm-hmm. With Batmite ending up getting the series canceled.
Yep.
It's pretty good.
And the teaser for a Batgirl show we never got.
Yep. Oh well. Yeah, that's got a really happy, sunny ending and about, as long as you love it, it'll never go away kind of thing.
Well, and Batman literally giving you that speech.
Mm-hmm.
I think as a kid, when a show ended, the thing I would want the most is a character dealing with the fact that the show ended, and you never get that. So I could just imagine being 8 years old, following Brave and the Bold, and then the last episode is Batman literally telling me that this is over, but it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's really, really good.
Yeah. So, I don't know. If you kept letting... That's a weird pick, though, because it's so meta.
That's fair.
It
is super meta.
Like, it's really fucking meta. Like, I was gonna make the point of, like, if you just let the story play out, like, I don't know, pick fucking random-ass rom-com, 50 First Dates, like, that has a weird ending wherein she's, like, waking up every morning and she's in the Arctic and they're married and have, like, a 3-year-old or some shit. And I sit there and I think to myself, I'm like, you know, it's sweet when the kid's too young to realize what's going on. That kid's gonna have, like, you know, teenagers are shitty people, and they have the right to be, because being a teenager is awful. But, you know, they say things that hurt, and they need acknowledgement and support, because they are at a tender age. What happens when that kid is a teenager and his mom doesn't remember that he exists? You know? Or maybe it's a girl, I can't even remember. But, like, the more you think about a story, the more where things have to proceed. When you start to put reality into a thing, as you continue something, it kind of inherently becomes more tragic, because it starts to mirror life in a way. The longer something goes, the more it mirrors life, and the more tragic it becomes. Do you think that's a fair thing to say, or am I just being a pessimist?
No, I agree with you. I say that so reluctantly, but no, I do.
Well, like, you know, it's interesting to think of, because I'm sitting here connecting a bunch of dots in my head now, and so we're going to go to our Lord and Savior, Grant Morrison. And I'm thinking particularly about the Animal Man comic.
Oh, God. That story is the saddest fucking thing ever.
Well, like, I'm thinking particularly about his conversation with Animal Man, where he says something to the effect of, we made you more dark and gritty and tragic because we thought it made you more interesting, but what the hell does that say about us? And the thing is, comics are one of the few forms of serialized storytelling where we kept adding stuff. Like, we always talk about comics being the modern mythology. They didn't keep making myths, you know? They didn't keep adding to the canon of Greek mythology. There are no new gods in Greek mythology. They all kind of are around about the same time. Like, the end of the Greek mythic era is the Odyssey. And then, like, there aren't new myths created throughout. There might be, like, one or two small ones, but nothing huge. Whereas with comics, we're still adding to the mythology. It's an evolving mythology. It's a story that's not going to end. So, of course, it's getting more tragic.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Animal Man's a weird pick, but you're right, partly because that's literally the last scene of Animal Man is where everything is set right and everyone's happy again, and it's technically a happy ending, but knowing how it got there is exceptionally tragic, and you can never look at that book the same way again.
Mm-hmm. And, like, even though it has that happy ending, quote-unquote, around it, the whole premise is it's going to get bad again because this is the direction the industry is headed.
It's going to get bad again, and that his happiness is purely on the whim of the writer, and that's terrifying and haunting even when he knows it's not there.
Mm-hmm.
Fuck, Animal Man's one of my favorite things. Why haven't I read that again in a while?
I've never gotten to read all the way through it. I've only read the issue where Morrison shows up.
If you don't count his Batman, I think Animal Man's the best thing he ever did.
That's crazy to say.
I
think you say that about everything.
Conversation a few times where we talk about our favorite Morrison. There is nothing he's ever done that touches Animal Man for me except Batman.
Wow, that's craziness.
I love his Animal Man to death.
Okay. No, but, like, there is that notion of, as the story keeps going, life becomes more apparent, and so it inherently becomes more tragic.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of where I'm, because life is tragic, you know. there's so many great, just nihilistic as fuck quotes from philosophers. I think it's Sartre. Everything is born without reason, prolongs itself out of weakness, and dies by chance. It is just so tremendously bleak.
Bleak is good though. I think the thing people miss about nihilism as a form of philosophy or perspective is that because everything has this meaninglessness and sadness and ending, it gives you opportunity to give things meaning, and that's deeply important.
Mm-hmm. It gives you a power. It's liberating in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, the quote from Angel is a thing I love because I think it's perfectly philosophically apt, and that's a quote that I really liked, and 5 years of studying philosophy in an undergrad and a graduate level, I still haven't found anything that makes this quote wrong. Was when Angel says, if nothing we do matters, then all that matters is what we do, because that's all there is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good-ass line. You've mentioned that several times.
I love it. It's fantastic. It makes perfect sense. If things are devoid of meaning, that means things have a space for meaning.
Mm-hmm. No, you're right. Okay. We need a couple more minutes here on tragedy, but that's a really, really good spot. I really like how we got there.
No, I agree with you. I like that you picked this topic. Not only because I've read a ton on tragedy since writing that Civil War video and because I find it interesting, but because I think that the whole idea of connecting with other people's suffering, especially now, is deeply important. Especially when old people tell younger people to, like, get over things.
Oh, God.
That's fucking bullshit, and it's always going to be bullshit because there are certain things you can't get over no matter how much you try. I'm sorry.
Uh-huh.
But also because I've written a couple other papers since that Civil War tragedy where I talked about how the way comic books are designed, it's the perfect analog for what it feels like to experience trauma. And you can see more of that in the Mr. Miracle video I did, because the whole point of it is that trauma is a thing that it's an experience that's too big for you to internalize. And so there's like a sense of timelessness that happens with it, and timelessness that goes with not being able to fit in a particular space. So comics, they're always one moment broken up into several moments. And if you can understand implicitly how time works in comics, how one panel to the next, to the next, to the next is a linear progression of time, but you can still understand each individual panel as its own event, that's exactly what trauma is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's deeply important. That doesn't mean all comics are inherently tragic, but all understanding seems to always have that weird tragic foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to give someone empathy is to recognize suffering.
Yeah, I agree. And to your point earlier about this idea of getting over anything, you never get over anything. You learn to live with it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Man, this is such a weird pull, but it's a line that, like, always really stuck with me for one reason or another. So in the first X-Men movie, Rogue sees Logan use the metal claws for the first time.
Yeah.
And then she starts driving with him, and she just keeps looking at his hands. And she asks him, does it hurt when they come out? And he says, every time? And that's something that, like, I think is just really, really universally relatable. Like, even though it's a part... Like, I feel like if you metaphorize the claws as traumatic events and the experience of using them in day-to-day life, I think that really works. It's like, no matter how far away you get from something traumatic, no matter how trivial or necessary to existence it might seem, like the death of a parent, that's still a part of you. And you still feel it the same way every time it comes back into your head. It never goes away. It just becomes part of how you exist. It becomes a day in school. Like, let's see here. Today is 3/8/2018. You would have been in high school on 3/8/20 or 2006, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What'd you learn that day?
What? I don't know.
Exactly. But it's just a part of you. You were there, more than likely. You were there. You learned something that day, I'm sure.
Probably.
It's just a part of what made you at that point. And so are traumatic events. The difference is you remember those specifically because of how much they changed you, or formed you, rather. And so, there's no getting over anything. You just learn to live with it. And, the tragedy of tragic stories is there's no getting over what happens to these characters in the story that you're reading. They are going to have to continue to live with it, unless, of course, they die.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense, because if we go back to what we said earlier about tragedies being tragic because they leave you in a place of completely uncertain of what the future is supposed to hold, and if life is this whole notion of learning to live with things, then you have to learn to live with the fact that you don't know what's going to happen next, and that's deeply important.
Mm-hmm. Man, dropping some truth, man.
Yeah, I mean, that's what fiction does. I would like to know in the comments, if you're okay with this, what if people do like tragic fiction, what their kind of go-tos are. I have noticed, with me at least, as much as I love the genre of tragedy and tragedies as a concept and stuff, those stories tend to stay with me longer, so I watch them less frequently.
No, I totally understand that. Like, I'll read a Tom King comic, but, like, it fucks me up every time.
Yeah, like, I don't have to reread War of Jokes and Riddles consistently to get that. I know that story intricately from that first initial experience. So I would like to know in the comments if people have certain classical tragedies or contemporary tragedies, or sad comics, sad movies, sad TV shows, anything that they think that they like a lot. Doesn't have to be something that they revisit a lot, but something that they probably think about a lot. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is a thing that I haven't gone back and read since high school, and I've only seen the movie once, and that was probably 3 or 4 years ago. But I still know it really well. Mm-hmm. And I still think of it as my favorite tragic story of anything. I haven't read Oedipus more than once or Antigone more than once, but I still know them really well. I just wonder if anyone else has that kind of experience. If they have a thing that deeply fucked them up in the head because of how sad it was, and they just kind of lived with it.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point, and it's really interesting how much that stuff sticks with you, because this isn't a tragic example, but it's an example that pulls an emotional reaction from me every time I think about it. It's an episode of Star Trek Voyager called Muse, and B'Elanna Torres gets stranded on this pre-warp civilization that's very similar to ancient Greece.
Of course,
Of course. And she's discovered by a playwright who, like, demands that he tell him her story. And so she explains, like, the Enterprise, or the Voyager, the Borg, Captain Janeway, all this stuff. And he reveals that the reason he needs to know all this is because his king is about to go to war, and he wants to write a play to convince him otherwise. And you get to see a moment from the play that is so fucking good, and it perfectly summarizes the philosophy behind Star Trek. But it's the actors pretending to be Janeway and the Borg Queen, and they're sitting there yelling, spitting venom at each other, yelling and screaming and fighting, and the Borg Queen says, "I'll send 1,000,000 of my men to kill you, and then if you kill all of them, 1,000,000 more." And Janeway replies back, and then I'll send a million of mine and a million of mine again, and it'll go back and forth again and again and again until all that's left is our hatred. And I'm getting a little choked up just thinking about that line. I don't know if I did it justice, but something about that is so fucking perfectly Star Trek. Of like, hate breeds nothing, vengeance breeds nothing. All it leaves is destruction in its path. And there's this need to come together. There's this need to, at some point, forgive and move on. And so like that's not a tragic example because it actually ends up working and all this stuff, but. Damn, there's moments in things that can stick with you in fiction, and it continues on.
Yeah,
so,
I agree.
Yeah, there's some great stuff like that. Anyway.
I would like to maybe just add one final point to anyone that thinks that maybe we exaggerate how much personal impact there is in talking about the fictional stuff in this way. I don't know if I brought up this example with you before, but there was a supermax prison in what state was it? I think it was Ohio, called TAMS, and there was a project called the TAMS 10, which basically was go to the inmates and ask them questions that would produce art. Like, for example, you would ask them, if you could have a picture of anything in the world, what would it be? And then artists would create those pictures and stuff like that. And the project was called TAMS 10 because they thought by doing this, they could shut down the prison in 10 years. After about 2 years of producing art that reflected what the prisoners were feeling, the prison shut down.
Wow.
Like, so this is deeply important. To be able to express your suffering and convey that artistically, it's a powerful thing.
Mm-hmm. Damn.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to look into that. That's really cool.
Yeah, there's a documentary about it, I think.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that'll do it for this episode. I feel like we thoroughly covered that topic in around an hour. You know, just an entire branch of fiction.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, you know, I'm good. I think no one needs to make tragedies anymore. We got this. All right. Well, Ruben, of course, did not join us this week, but he has picked something for next week. So next week we will be reviewing The Road with Viggo Mortensen.
The Road, you said?
Yeah, The Road.
Okay, let me look into this real quick.
Yeah, Viggo Mortensen. I know that name. I don't know the actor off the top of my head.
Viggo Mortensen. Oh, okay, I know this movie. Never mind.
Okay, cool. All right, everyone, thanks very much for watching. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
Now I'm the Exile.
And we are your Geeky Gentlemen. And we will be discussing things.